Welcome back to Prime Your Day, Prime Your Midlife. And one of our 5 fundamentals is all around nutrition and obviously health. And today I am so delighted to bring to the screen today Mr. Peter Campbell, who runs his own business called Life Without Limits. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit about nutrition, but absolutely his own personal journey through midlife. Peter Campbell, welcome to the podcast on the screen today. Great to see you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. And yeah, we've had many conversations in the past about a whole variety of things. So looking forward to sharing some of our conversation with those that are tuning in today to the podcast. So yeah, hi to everybody else.
Yeah, it's actually quite, I've known you for a long time, sort of as an acquaintance or a personality in the business world. But it was one of those serendipitous moments where a colleague of mine, Tom, said, you should go to this event that Peter's speaking at. And it happened to be free. It happened to be something that piqued my curiosity. And I really enjoyed listening to your adventure. But Let's start with a question first of all, Peter. What does midlife, the phrase midlife, mean to you?
I think for me, Chris, that phrase conjures up, certainly in my own experience, a time of some underlying restlessness, some questioning, some feelings that maybe things weren't quite how I thought they might be or where they wanted to be. It was almost about going through another transition, perhaps not quite as hormonally induced as our transition in puberty, but that same kind of transition as you were moving from those 20s and 30s, perhaps then into your 40s and 50s. And it was that transitional period that I found was and I had my own struggles with that. I worked as an orthopedic surgeon and was really, really busy. My career had got to a point where I had reached the pinnacle, but I was still under a lot of stress and responsibility, working a lot of hours, and I was continuing to drive my career and beginning to get a sense that things weren't really going in my whole life balance the way that I wanted to go, but kind of couldn't get off the treadmill and didn't really know what to do about it. So for me, midlife is that time in all of our life. I think it happens to both men and women, and my knowledge now around lifestyle and nutrition that you mentioned is that there's just as much hormonal change going on for us in our 40s and 50s as there are in our teenage years. We just don't necessarily appreciate it or give ourselves enough space to be able to go through that transition, which inevitably is, all transitions and change are going to be uncomfortable and provide a degree of uncertainty. So
yeah, and we're going to lean into that. We're going to lean into that aspect of sort of hormonal and how that can be really managed in a health and nutritional way, which we'll get to later. But just as another question, I ask this to everybody: do you think that midlife should be associated with the word crisis or mindset? Where does it sit with you?
Yeah, I think that its association with crisis does us all a great disservice, I think, because I think it just puts a coating on the phrase that automatically is one of negative. It emphasizes some of that discomfort and uncertainty which is there, but in a much more devastating way. And I think there is a huge opportunity that comes with midlife to embrace this new transition, this new phase of our life, and to actually accept and grow even further through it. So I think the kind of media talk about midlife crisis, whilst it has a ring to it, I'm not sure it really helps us as we approach it. It makes it too glib, it makes it too superficial, and I think people are less likely, particularly men, are less likely to open up and to talk about some of the challenges, some of the uncertainties that they're experiencing, because they don't want to be seen as somebody who's in crisis mode.
Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? And because we have this thought process that is associated with crisis, well, that's not something I really want to talk about because I don't want to be associated with such a negative connotation. Okay, so it's a mindset issue. Brilliant. So when you were going through this orthopedic journey and you talked about being at the pinnacle of that, was there like a niggling itch that you felt you had to scratch, or was it a smack in the face moment that just said, no, Peter, you do need to make a change here?
Well, you know, for me, there was almost an element of both, because I think there was an awareness that something needed to change, and I wasn't quite sure what it was. I was going into my 40s, behaving as if I was still in my late 20s and 30s, and expecting my body and my mindset to be able to cope and recover in the same way. And I was struggling at letting go of some of that and embracing that physiological change that naturally happens. But mentally, I just knew that I needed to do something a bit different. I needed to challenge myself in a different way. And I wasn't really quite sure what that was. I didn't really have a concept as to what that was until I came across the opportunity to take part in the Clip Around the World yacht race, or at least in a couple of segments of it. And you talk about something hitting you in the face. And obviously there were clearly some things that happened along the way that perhaps cultivated me and made me receptive to that message when it finally arrived. But I just knew, even though I didn't have a background of doing a lot of sailing, I just knew that the idea of being out in the open water, being out in nature, being with a team, challenging ourselves against the worst that nature had to throw at us as we crossed an ocean, was something that really connected with me. And other people will connect with something different. But I think for me, it was that idea of getting out into nature in its rawest, most untamed kind of way. And the ocean was something that really appealed to me, probably because it was so different from landlocked York. It couldn't have been, it was poles apart, literally.
Well, it's flat. I mean, there's two similarities between York and the
not always flat, I can tell you now.
Okay, so just before we talk about, embarking on that journey, did you have some moments of thought that were quite dark or oppressive or vulnerable, where you really looked at yourself and just thought, well, hang on a minute, this is not what I should be doing as the best version of myself?
Yeah, no, there certainly were. And I went through a period of time in my midlife when I fell into the trap of pushing my career. I thought I was eating healthily, but in reality, looking back now, knowing what I now know, I wasn't. I was certainly working far too many hours. I was exercising in a way that was high activity, playing squash, trying to do a lot of running, doing stuff that was high octane stuff, which probably, again, in reflection, just elevated all of my kind of stress. And I was neglecting some of the stuff that was going on at home. And thrown into that mix that, yes, it's easy to slip into perhaps drinking too much alcohol and that type of stuff as well. When you're out socializing or getting home from work late, you reach for a beer or a bottle of wine. And that had its toll. And with my darkest times were after I went through a divorce, and a really challenging time, because family is really important to me, and I held myself to account for that, of course, because I was a part of that downfall of that marriage, and I really took that self-criticism to heart, and actually, in the early days, not in a healthy way, in a very self-destructive way, suffered with some degree of depression and mental health issues that fortunately I came through with support, and was able to build and move on from that point in time.
It's such a sensitive time, and I've been through a very similar journey. I don't want this podcast to avoid asking the question that maybe other people would like to know. When you say you reached out and you asked who did you turn to? How did you ask the question? And what did that look like for you when you felt that feeling of vulnerability, and you needed some reassurance, or you needed to dig deeper with your own feelings of whether or not you call it guilt or shame, or however you want to position it? Where did you go?
Yeah. So I took a long time to reach out. A lot of it I initially attempted to sort out myself. But it's interesting that at that time I had some close friends and some very close family siblings who recognised that something wasn't right. And even though I wasn't voicing it, they recognised that something wasn't right. And they reached out to me. And fortunately, I took the hand that was being offered, and that was the start of the journey. And then went through some more kind of formal support through counselling with their help. But I have to say, it was people recognising and having the courage to check up, to check in, and to hold their hand out, and to keep that hand there, even though I didn't pick it up in the first instance. Those are important lessons to me. A, to ask for help more frequently, even now, and perhaps even more so now, but actually also to not be afraid about reaching out to other people, and not being afraid of getting it wrong, because some people are really struggling, but they don't know where to go, and all they're looking for is someone to give them an opportunity to start to talk. Yeah.
And I know in particular from a divorce situation, there are also two sides, those that are with and those that are without, and you almost are afraid of who are your best confidants as the people that to talk to. But I think that the clue that you talk about there was that you offer some formal assistance with counselling, and that would be my own reflection, is that the best assistance comes from the best qualified, and the people that are able to really lead you to a more free and more fulfilling perspective are those that have got the qualifications to do just that. But
the other point on that, I think that's a really good point, Chris. I think that accepting the help of friends and close family meant that I had more confidence about taking that more formally. But actually, that level of independence that a professional has is really, really important, because you are getting that level of honest counselling and honest support that you can then take on. And that's where I made the greatest progress, undoubtedly, was with that professional level of help.
Okay, so interesting. We've gone from independence and feeling as though you weren't giving maybe the family what you wanted, and then you took the decision to go on a boat by yourself for quite a long period of time. Tell me how that sort of journey manifested itself as to this seems like a good idea.
Well, clearly there was a period of time between those various instances, and it was a good decade, 12 years between the divorce, getting all of that out of my system, rebalancing my life. There's people who've been through that situation now, particularly when there's children involved, and you have to kind of restructure what you do, and your sense of responsibility, and what it means to be a father, and all that type of stuff. And I had been fortunate enough towards the end of that decade to develop a new relationship with my wife, Nikki, who is, my business partner at Life Without Limits now. So I was in a very different place 12 years later after the divorce, when the Clipper experience came along. And of course that meant that the children were that little bit older. But having said that, my initial enthusiasm to do this, go off on a boat and put myself first, was a real challenge to me, because although it was something that I knew I desperately wanted to do, I was initially very much held back. But yes, this is really selfish. Yes, it means that I'm going to spend time away and leave the kids on their own, and who's going to look after my mum, and who's going to be there for my sisters, and who's going to be there for Nikki, and what do we do about income? And it's just too complicated. and actually it's all about me. And I put that therefore on the back burner for a long time. And it was again Nikki and actually the kids who when they heard what I would thought about, who said, well, for God's sakes, of course you should do it. You're in your early to mid 50s, and actually all you've done for the last 30 years is try and provide for us. Of course you need time to go and do your thing. We think it's a really exciting adventure. And again, it was only when I made lots of assumptions about what they might think about it. I told lots of stories in my head about how people would perceive me and my intentions, and in actual fact people didn't think it was selfish, they didn't think it was self-centered, they didn't think I was doing the right thing. They thought it was a really exciting, thought I was completely mad, of course, but thought it was a really exciting thing to do. So
Okay.
It was another lesson for me about the importance of being more open with those people that are close to us about what's going on in our heads. And I think as men particularly, we often don't do that enough for fear of the ridicule, for fear of being, kind of shouted down or put off.
There's a great sentence I've heard somewhere that we really still are very primal in terms of our thinking system. And we haven't had an upgrade yet. You get the normal iPhone and the system update comes along and it reboots the phone in order for it to be able to concentrate on the new bugs or viruses or whatever else. And yet as human beings, we're still very much hunter-gatherers and we haven't had the upgrade yet. But we're trying to live in a modern world and a modern brain system. There's a sentence you had there when you said you were desperately wanting to do this, the clipper. Can I just ask why? What was it behind desperately wanting to do this that meant so much to you?
Yeah, I think for me, there was something about for me personally, needing to know how far I could push myself. There was something about needing to know whether I could do it. One of the problems was once I'd seen the concept of the clipper, I then started saying, well, that's not for you because you're not brave enough, you're not strong enough, you don't know enough sailing.
Can we just, sorry, there's maybe not enough knowledge about what exactly is the clipper.
No, sure.
So can you just explain what is the clipper? I know what it is, but there are many people that just probably have no idea exactly what a big experience, adventure, and a mental challenge that this is, not let alone the physical.
Yeah, great point. So for those people that aren't aware, Clipper Around the World Yacht Race, you can Google it, you can search it. Effectively, the Clipper Around the World Yacht Race is as it says, it's a race of currently 11 boats, all identical. They are crewed with a professional paid skipper and first mate, but the rest of the crew are completely amateur. So you apply to do either a single leg, multiple legs, or to do the whole circumnavigation of the globe. And that circumnavigation takes approximately 10 months by the time they have had various stopovers at different host ports around the world. So you're anywhere between 14, 15, 16, up to maybe 20 crew. Those crew are, as I say, completely amateur. Some may have a little bit of sailing experience, may even own their own boat and be regular weekend sailors. But a significant proportion of those crew will be people who have never set foot on a boat until they actually started the training program with the Clipper. And the whole idea of Clipper is to give people the confidence and the experience of being able to do major ocean sailing, but in almost the protection of a big organization with a lot of support and safety and all that type of stuff behind it. But you still, of course, have to sail the yacht. You still, of course, have to endure the elements, and you have to organize with your team all the victualling and the food and how you're going to nourish yourselves over that 4-6 week period, and all of that type of stuff. So a huge learning curve, but a fantastic experience. For me, the other advantage was that it wasn't a lone experience. It was something that I was doing as part of a team, which has always been important to me, team sports and working in teams in the hospital. So I didn't want to go out and do something that was solitary. I wanted to challenge myself in the way that meant I was also getting to know people and getting to understand how we could work together and form that team bonding was really interesting to me.
But you talk about team, but effectively you're putting 12 people through the eye of a needle and expecting them to live with each other in very, very stressful, adverse, physically uncomfortable decisions, debilitated by sleep, energy, and everything else. So not exactly the most, well, yeah, when you say team, you could find yourself wrestling with 11 strangers that actually you don't want to have any time with.
And you're absolutely right. Inevitably, this type of event attracts a certain type of person. So you inevitably have at least the desire to do something interesting and exciting that binds you together. But you're absolutely right, Chris. It takes people from all sorts of and all walks of life. And there were inevitably some people that you naturally gelled with. And there were some people with whom there was a little bit of friction, at least superficially. And I think it was part of the reason I wanted to do it. Was really interesting to see how I could work through that and how I could use that as part of my own personal growth to work with people under stressful situations, people that ordinarily you wouldn't necessarily bond with, but in those situations you just simply had to. And so that was a really interesting part of it. And in my experience, what ends up happening is that when you get to the end of your journey, as we did when we crossed the Atlantic, you were such a tight group of people that you couldn't have got a piece of paper between them. That team bonding, certainly for us on our yacht, Team Seattle, was certainly the case. We had grown together, we had occasionally fought together, but we'd certainly been there to pick each other up and to dust each other down. And and it doesn't matter how much potential friction there is when somebody slips on the deck and is being covered in waves and stuff, then you reach down and you grab them and you give them a hand to get back on your feet, and those sorts of things were really life-changing.
Okay, there's a couple of moments that I've heard about from the challenge that I just want to go into, which is overboard and maybe your first 24 hours. But before you do talk about that, had you written down any kind of contract with yourself before you embarked on this to say, Peter, as a result of doing this, you are going to be, fill in the sentence? What had you sat down and said, this is what this is going to deliver for me by way of a purpose or passion, or was it just a free sense of, I'm curious to see where this is going to go?
I think it was more the latter. I mean, there was a degree of structure to it. I started off wanting to do the whole circumnavigation, and events made me reconsider that. And it was clear that was my ego talking. That wasn't really practical. That was just my ego talking about doing the whole thing. And so I then did sit down and say, okay, exactly what do I want? Why am I doing it? What do I want to get out of it? What is it that's important to me? And I was able to then put together 3 different elements of the Clipper race, 3 different segments that would deliver the experiences that I was looking for. In terms of what it would bring me as an individual, I actually wasn't that specific. I was actually very much happy with taking the view, do you know what, I know this is going to be an incredible experience, and I know that it won't be all incredible in a good way. Some of it will be incredible in a really challenging and difficult way. And I'm just going to go with it and see what sort of person I come out with at the end, what sort of reflections I've got, see how it's changed me, if at all. And I'm sure that it would. And see where that goes, and kind of use it as a bit of a reflective position as well as a challenge, because we did get lots of time when we were sitting on the boat doing very little to actually reflect on what I've done so far in my life and maybe what I wanted to do next. So I was very comfortable with being a little bit vague about the specific outcomes.
Okay. And were you a normal practicer of reflective meditation or internal checking in with yourself? I heard of the ego check in there, that you were aware that the ego was the person that was trying to take control. Was that something that you were very congruent with before, being able to speak to your own mind?
To a degree, I certainly in the years leading up to my decision to do the Clipper, I'd become more open to, more involved in that type of personal reflection. Obviously, as part of my career as a doctor and a surgeon, there's always been professional reflection. But I think if I've been perfectly honest, during my 20s and 30s, then I didn't take much interest in the meditation, personal benefits of reflection, quiet time, and that type of thing. But undoubtedly, after the events of my divorce and all of the inner turmoil and the mental health challenges, that taught me a lot about, and through the counselling, that taught me a lot about the benefits of taking some of that time, checking in with yourself, and actually sometimes just being comfortable just to check in without being too analytical, just letting it sit, some of those questions sit with you, and just see what came out over the next day or two as you came to your mind as you just sat with some of those things, rather than trying to be constantly using our analytical modern brain, rather than just letting, as you say, our hunter-gatherer instincts just come to the fore over time.
Okay, well, I've teased a few people. Tell me how you felt 24 hours into the challenge, Peter, as to this should be a brilliant moment. Kind of got this vision of you, Titanic on the front of the boat, arms outstretched, sucking in the sea and the waves, thinking, yes, what a brilliant decision, Peter. How was that for you?
So the first 12, 18 hours weren't too bad. We'd left London, beautiful sunshine, and we'd sailed out to the mouth of the estuary, and actually I was feeling pretty good. And within 24 hours of that start, we were only in the English Channel. We were about to sail to Uruguay across the Atlantic, and we were only in the English Channel, probably off the coast of Dover. I mean, we were nowhere. And I was in my bunk off watch, and I was at the lowest point in my life. I hadn't slept for 36 hours. I'd been vomiting with seasickness for at least 12, if not 18 hours. Hadn't had anything to eat during that time period. Couldn't even keep any fluid down. The watch system had disturbed all of my sleep, so I was tired, I was hungry, I was dehydrated, and I just thought, this is the most ridiculous position for me to be in. Somebody who's supposedly sensible and mature and, been through all the career decisions that I've been through. What on earth am I doing squashed into a bunk that was wedged at 30 degrees to the side of the boat, because the boat was all keeled over, bouncing and bucking and hitting the waves and the noise. If there'd been a passing cross-channel ferry, I would have been on there like a shot. And I genuinely thought, this is the biggest mistake I've ever made. The first opportunity I get, I'm off this boat. We were due for a scheduled stop in Portugal for a few days to restock things and maintain the boat before we went across the Atlantic. And I thought, I'm on the first flight back to Leeds, Bradford. Gave it a go, but it's clearly not for me. I was lying there knowing that in less than an hour I needed to get up out of the bunk to go and do my turn on watch. And I knew as soon as I climbed out of the bunk, I would start feeling sick again, and I would start retching. And just the thought of that was bad enough. And I became really angry. And I became angry at myself for being so stupid. I became angry with the boat and the wind and the waves and the weather. I became angry with the crew that weren't seasick for being okay. I became angry with the crew that were snoring and sleeping when I couldn't. I got myself into a right tiz, to be honest. At the same time, that was probably where I made most of my learning. It was probably more valuable than all the team building, personal development courses I had been on, because I had to really dig deep to accept where I was, understand that it was part of the journey, that that any challenge, any life journey is going to be full of disappointments. It's going to be full of frustrations. It's going to be full of some pain. But actually, it's the suffering that we bring to it by how we interpret it that makes all the difference. And I had to change my mindset. I had to change my thoughts. I had to change my approach and see this as part of the adventure, knowing that actually in reality, it wasn't going to last forever. You know, it was going to get better, maybe not the next hour or the next 6 hours, but at some point the seasickness would get better.
And had you thought about any of that aspect of complete and utter horribleness by preparing for the worst and thinking about how you would have been resilient in that mindset, or had it not even crossed your mind that this was something that was even going to come and hit you?
I obviously considered that there will be times when I was going to be seasick, particularly at the start. And I knew it would take a while to get used to the sleeping patterns, and maybe the food wouldn't be what I was used to. But from that aspect, I think, to be honest, I was a little bit blasé about it. I've been a junior doctor working 100 hours a week. I've been a new parent with newborn children. I'd be okay. I had no idea the combined effect of all of that, the lack of sleep, the lack of nutrition, the dehydration, the frustration, and it made it worse, I think, Chris, because it was so early in the race.
Yeah.
It was so early in the adventure. If I'd been 3 or 4 weeks, then I possibly would have been able to cope with it a lot more. But it was so early, I just thought, I haven't even got beyond Dover and I can't cope. So I was completely unprepared. And I guess when you're going into these sorts of things, no amount of training on the English Channel is going to prepare you for crossing the Atlantic. So it's only when you're in those situations that you really experience them and understand that level of resilience. And I had to remind myself that's why I wanted to do it. You know, in the armchair back at home, cozy up, looking at the brochure, it was testing myself that prompted me to do that, both physically, mentally, fitness, all of that type of stuff. And so I couldn't complain because I was being tested. And
that test now, has it empowered you to be more resilient, more determined to push through those challenges when they're presented to you in everyday life now? Or has it enabled you to be more calm? Or, you know, what's the lesson that you've brought from that moment of complete and utter despair that is now with you now?
It absolutely has. And I think it's what's brought with me is that not only me, but I think each and every one of us have far more potential than we often give ourselves credit for. Have far more resilience, have far more strength, have far more compassion, have far more kindness, have far more grace than we often give ourselves credit for. And some of that kindness and compassion is not necessarily to other people, it's to ourselves. I think we are often, our own worst critics. So undoubtedly, that experience has taught me that actually, it doesn't matter how bad it gets, there will always be a solution. I can find a way through this. It may not be pretty and it may not be easy, but I can find a way through it. And undoubtedly, linking that with what we talked about before about reaching out more readily has made that a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that transcendence from despair to not necessarily joy, was it a gradual process? Did you chunk one thing down at a time to conquer your seasickness, or did you just kind of gradually go, do you know what, I have no choice but to lean into this and do it anyway?
Yeah, it was absolutely the latter. It was changing my mindset, and that didn't happen straight away. But once I had recognized that actually, as you eloquently put it, you've got to lean into it. You've just got to embrace it. This is, what a story this is. Just enjoy the adventure as much as you can. Then I thought, you know what? I've just got to get on with this. I've just got to get on with it. And actually, as soon as I had made that decision that I was going to accept it, I was going to move on, I was going to bring it on almost. Okay, is that the worst that you've got? Throw a few more waves at me or whatever. As soon as I took that attitude, actually, almost instantaneous. Didn't seem quite so bad.